The crystal chandeliers of Sterling Heights cast fractured light across marble floors slick with old money and new ambition.
I'll be there in 10 minutes. Just
Diane Harrington
finalizing
didn't
the
notice.
details.
She never did. Her heels clicked a rhythm of absolute certainty as she swept through the restaurant's entrance, one hand pressed to her phone, the other reaching for her 7-year-old son's hand through a world that parted for her like water. Her hand closed on empty air. For the second time in 7 years, Ethan had slipped away from her. This time toward a stranger's table where laughter sounded like something she'd forgotten how to recognize. The phone buzzed against her ear. Mathan Chen's voice carried the particular strain of a CFO who'd spent 6 weeks watching a coup assemble itself in real time. Diane, Gerald's moved the vote up. 9:15. That's 43 minutes. She turned, irritation flashing across features that had graced Forbes covers and demolished boardroom opponents with equal efficiency. Her son stood frozen 3 steps behind, small face gone soft with something she couldn't identify. "Ethan, we don't have Mama." His whisper cut through every calculation flooding her mind. "He's fixing things." She followed his gaze to a corner table she would have walked past without a second thought. A man in his late 30s sat hunched over something in his hands, worn flannel shirt faded to the color of old denim, fingers working with the kind of focus surgeons brought to operating tables. Across from him, a little girl with uneven pigtails kicked her feet under the table, telling some elaborate story with wild hand gestures that threatened water glasses. The man, Marcus, though Diane wouldn't learn his name for another 4 minutes, pressed a small screwdriver against the underside of his chair. 3 careful twists. He tested the seat with his palm, nodded once, then shifted his attention to the little girl's plate with the same unhurried precision. "See, sweetheart, you can't rush hot things." His voice carried the particular patience of someone who'd explained this 1,000 times and would explain it 1,000 more. He touched a forkful of spaghetti to the inside of his wrist, a gesture so automatic it spoke of muscle memory, of nights spent alone with an infant learning what burns felt like. Still too hot. Another minute. The little girl, Lily, 5 years old and already fluent in the language of a father who showed up, leaned forward with theatrical urgency.
"But Papa, the dragon was this big."
Her arms spread wide, knocking over the pepper shaker in a spray of black specks across white linen. Marcus caught it without breaking eye contact, his hand moving with the kind of reflexes that came from emergency rooms or years of preventing small disasters before they became large ones. Even dragons respect restaurant acoustics, Lil. Inside voice. The girl dissolved into giggles that rang out clear and bright, the kind of sound that made strangers smile without knowing why. Marcus twisted pasta around her fork with one hand, while his other reached for his own untouched plate, a choreography of care so practiced it looked effortless. Diane felt Ethan's hand slip from hers. "Ethan!" But her son was already moving, drawn toward that table with the magnetic inevitability of metal toward lodestone. She followed on heels that clicked sharp warnings against marble, one hand already reaching to redirect, to control, to restore proper boundaries between their world and whatever this was. Ethan stopped at the edge of their table. Marcus looked up, surprise flickering across features that were handsome in an understated way, the kind of face that carried stories in the lines around eyes that had seen too much and chosen kindness anyway. "Hi." Ethan's whisper barely qualified as sound. Lily beamed with the immediate warmth of a child who hadn't yet learned that strangers might mean danger.
"Hi, I'm Lily. Do you like pasta?"
"Ethan." Diane's voice carried boardroom authority wrapped in maternal civility, the tone that made executive assistants scramble and board members straighten their spines. "We need to sit down." Her son wasn't listening, his gaze fixed on the screwdriver now resting beside Marcus's plate, on the man's hands, scarred across the knuckles, calloused in places that spoke of work done with tools instead of keyboards. Can I sit with you?" The question emerged so small, so naked with longing, that Diane felt something crack behind her ribs in a place she'd long since learned to ignore. Marcus's eyes shifted to her, assessing, understanding, carefully neutral in a way that told her he'd navigated these waters before. "I think your mom might have other plans, buddy." "I don't mind," Lily announced with the confident authority of childhood. She patted the seat beside her with proprietary enthusiasm. "You can sit here." Ethan looked up at Diane with eyes that held a question she didn't know how to answer. Around them, Sterling Heights' ambient noise seemed to pause. She could feel the weight of watching eyes, clientele who recognized her, who were already cataloging this moment, this deviation from expected behavior. Victoria Harrington didn't sit at tables with strangers in worn flannel. Diane Harrington didn't let her son interrupt other people's dinners. CEOs worth $3 billion certainly didn't allow 7-year-olds to dictate their schedules 41 minutes before a meeting that would determine whether she kept her father's company or watched vultures pick it apart. "Please, Mama." When had Ethan last asked her for anything that wasn't permission to be somewhere else, with someone else, doing something that didn't require her participation? When had he last looked at her with hope instead of careful politeness? The man was already standing, preparing to diffuse the situation with practiced grace. "It's okay. We don't want to intrude on your evening." "You're not intruding." The words left Diane's mouth before her mind approved them, before the part of her brain that had built an empire through calculated decisions and risk management could slam the brakes on whatever impulse was currently steering. "If Ethan would like to join you for a moment, I suppose we have time?" The man blinked. Lily clapped. Ethan's face lit up with something Diane couldn't name, but recognized as precious in the way you recognize things you're about to lose. Just like that, she found herself settling into a chair at a corner table, her perfect evening dissolving into something she couldn't control. Her phone buzzed twice, Nathan Chen wondering where she was, Gerald Sinclair probably smiling that shark smile, sensing blood in the water. The man extended his hand across the table. His palm was warm, calloused, scarred across the knuckles with the kind of marks that came from work that fought back. Marcus Webb. Diane Harrington. If the name registered, and it would have, everyone in Manhattan knew Harrington Global Industries. He didn't show it. His handshake was brief, professional, the grip of someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply without crushing or being crushed. Emma already introduced herself. He gestured toward Lily with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. She's subtle that way. Lily waved enthusiastically at Ethan, who had claimed the seat beside her with the kind of joy Diane usually only saw when he was being picked up early from events he'd been forced to attend. Noah doesn't usually approach strangers. The wrong name fell from her lips with the ease of exhaustion. She froze, hoping no one had noticed. I'm Ethan, Mama. Her son's voice carried gentle correction, the tone of a child who'd learned not to expect his mother to remember basic facts about him. You called me Noah again. The crack behind her ribs widened into a fissure. When had she last called him by the right name without needing to think about it? When had her own son become someone she needed to consciously remember instead of instinctively know? Marcus returned to cutting Lily's pasta with the same careful attention he'd shown before the interruption, testing temperature, checking size, a father for whom these tasks had become meditation. Kids have good instincts about people. His voice stayed level, without judgment, but Diane felt it anyway. The implicit commentary on what her instincts had become, what she'd traded away for quarterly earnings and market dominance. They see what matters. Ethan watched Marcus's hands with absolute focus, studying each movement the way other children studied magic tricks. Papa cuts it really small, Lily explained with the authority of an expert witness, so it doesn't burn my mouth. My mom doesn't cut my food. Ethan's statement landed with all the weight of simple fact, absent of accusation but heavy with implication. The silence that followed could have crushed bones. Diane's fingers tightened around her phone until the case creaked. Her son sat 3 feet away, announcing to strangers that his billionaire mother had raised him to feed himself at an age when other children still needed help, still deserved help, still got the kind of care that came from hands that showed up instead of delegating. Ethan has been feeding himself since he was 5. She heard the defense in her voice, hated it, couldn't stop it. That's impressive for his age. Marcus didn't look up from Lily's plate. Emma's working on it. We're not quite there yet.
I can do it!
Lily's protest carried indignation wrapped in marinara sauce.
But Papa's better at the twirly thing.
Ethan leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. The twirly thing? Marcus demonstrated, spinning pasta around a fork with casual expertise that spoke of thousands of dinners just like this one. Quiet evenings at tables where the only thing that mattered was making sure a little girl ate something warm and felt loved while doing it. It's all in the wrist. Want to try? Before Diane could intervene with some excuse about germs or propriety or the million other reasons wealthy children didn't share food with strangers, Ethan nodded. Marcus pushed his own untouched plate toward the boy with the generosity of someone for whom giving cost nothing, because it meant everything. Ethan's first attempt sent spaghetti sliding off the fork in a tangle of red sauce and disappointment. His second wasn't much better. Diane watched her son's face, waiting for the frustration, for the shutdown that came whenever something proved difficult, whenever perfection wasn't immediately achievable. Instead, Marcus's hand covered Ethan's smaller one, guiding the motion with gentle pressure. Easy. Let the fork do the work. You're just steering. On the third try, Ethan lifted a perfect spiral of pasta, his face bright with achievement so pure it hurt to witness. Excellent. Marcus's approval came simple, direct, earned without inflation or false praise. Now test the temperature. Ethan looked confused. Marcus took the fork, touched pasta carefully to his inner wrist with the automatic gesture of a parent who'd learned this lesson the hard way, then nodded. Safe. Your turn. Her son mimicked the movement with such careful precision that Diane felt something tighten in her throat. When had she last taught him anything practical, anything that mattered beyond test scores and college applications? Can you cut mine too? The question left Ethan's mouth before Diane's filter could catch it. Every eye in their section of Sterling Heights turned toward their table. She could feel judgment flowing like water finding cracks, seeping into foundations, beginning the slow work of erosion. Diane Harrington's son asking strangers to cut his food. The CEO who'd spent 15 years proving she could have it all, watching her son reveal exactly what she'd sacrificed to maintain that fiction. Marcus's eyes found hers, asking permission without words, professional courtesy from someone who understood boundaries even when children didn't. She should have said no. Should have stood, thanked him for his time, guided Ethan back to their proper table, where proper distance could be restored before this moment metastasized into something that would follow them both into tomorrow. "If you don't mind," Marcus pulled Ethan's untouched plate toward him and began cutting with the same unhurried attention he'd shown Lily. Diane watched his hands, scarred, steady, completely focused on a task most parents outsourced to nannies or ignored entirely in favor of teaching independence. When had she last cut Ethan's food? When had she last fed him at all, rather than ensuring staff prepared appropriate portions and monitored his nutrition with dietary precision calibrated to optimize growth and cognitive development? "So," Lily addressed Ethan with the seriousness of a diplomat opening negotiations, "what grade are you in?" "Second. I go to Ashworth Academy." "Is that far away?" "Kind of. I have a driver." Lily's eyes went wide with wonder bordering on disbelief. "Like a race car driver?" "No, like someone who drives me to school." The little girl processed this information with the gravity of a philosopher encountering a new paradox that rewrote previous assumptions about how the world functioned. "Why doesn't your mama drive you?" Ethan's gaze flickered to Diane with the wariness of a child who'd learned that honesty about his mother's absence carried consequences. "She's busy. She runs a big company." "Oh." Lily considered this with furrowed concentration. "Papa used to be busy too. Before." "Before what?" Marcus set Ethan's plate back in front of him, perfectly portioned, properly cooled, an act of service so small it barely registered as effort, but spoke volumes about the kind of father who'd chosen this life over whatever came before. "Before I decided busy wasn't the same as present," the words landed with surgical precision. Diane felt them settle somewhere behind her ribs in that place she'd spent 15 years learning to ignore, the place where guilt lived alongside ambition and fed on the same fuel. Her phone erupted against the table. Nathan's name flashed urgent summons. She glanced at the screen just long enough to read the preview. Board meeting moved up, Whitmore making his move early. "Need you here in 20. 20 minutes to get across Manhattan during dinner hour. 20 minutes to prepare for a fight that would determine whether she kept everything her father had built, everything she'd sacrificed to preserve, everything that justified the choices that had led to this moment, sitting at a stranger's table while her son learned basic care from a man whose last name she'd learned 4 minutes ago. Diane stood, smoothing her dress with practiced efficiency that concealed the tremor in her fingers. "Ethan, we need to go." Her son looked up from his pasta, disappointment washing across features still soft with childhood, but already learning the particular hardness that came from expecting nothing and receiving exactly that. "But I just started eating." "You can finish in the car." She was already calculating routes, rehearsing arguments, fortifying walls that kept chaos at bay and protected empires from men like Gerald Sinclair, who mistook temporary weakness for permanent vulnerability. "Please, Mama, can't we stay a little longer?" Every second counted. Every moment of delay gave Gerald more time to consolidate board votes, to paint her as distracted, unfocused, unfit for leadership because she'd spent 7 minutes at dinner instead of chained to a desk, proving her dedication through visible suffering. But Ethan was looking at her with eyes that held something she couldn't quite name, something that felt dangerously close to hope, wrapped in the expectation of disappointment. 10 minutes. The words escaped before strategy could stop them. No more. Ethan's smile could have powered the entire restaurant. Diane sat back down, tension coiling through shoulders that hadn't relaxed since her father's funeral 8 years ago, maybe longer. She fired off a response to Nathan with fingers that knew these movements in their sleep. "On my way. Stall him." Across the table, Marcus had returned to his own dinner, Pasta gone cold while he'd fed his daughter and helped a stranger's son. Sacrifices made without fanfare or expectation of recognition. He gave Ethan and Lily space to chat with the easy enthusiasm of children who hadn't yet learned that different worlds weren't supposed to touch. "Your son has good manners," Marcus spoke quietly, the observation carrying neither judgment nor praise, just statement of fact. "He was raised properly." "There's a difference between properly and well." Diane's eyes snapped to his face, searching for the insult, finding only calm assessment from someone who'd apparently decided social niceties mattered less than uncomfortable truth. "Excuse me?" "No offense intended." He took a bite of pasta that had definitely gone cold, chewing with the efficiency of someone accustomed to eating whatever was available whenever time permitted. "Just an observation." "You know nothing about how I raise my son." "You're right. I don't." He met her gaze with steady calm that didn't flinch under scrutiny designed to make CEOs squirm. "I just know what I see." "And what do you see?" "A kid who's hungry for something that isn't on the menu." The words hit like a physical blow. Diane's fingers tightened around her phone, hard enough that she felt the metal flex beneath the expensive case designed to protect against drops, but not against the particular pressure of a woman discovering her failures, announced by strangers in restaurants where she'd spent a decade building the kind of reputation now crumbling under casual observation. "That's presumptuous." "Maybe." Marcus's voice stayed level, absent judgment or accusation, just someone stating facts as he understood them. "But he asked me to cut his food." "When's the last time someone did that for him?" "He's 7 years old. He's perfectly capable. I'm not questioning his capability." The interruption was gentle but firm. "I'm questioning whether being capable means he should have to be." Diane opened her mouth to respond, to explain all the ways this stranger was wrong about her son, about her choices, about the impossible calculations required to build an empire while raising a child alone after Ethan's father had decided fatherhood was less interesting than a tech startup in San Francisco. Her phone exploded with notifications. The board meeting wasn't in 20 minutes. It was starting now. Gerald had accelerated everything, probably hoping she'd be late, flustered, unprepared, exactly the narrative he'd been building for 6 weeks about a CEO whose focus was slipping, whose judgment was compromised, who'd become a liability to shareholders and legacy alike. "I have to go." She stood again, this time with finality that permitted no negotiation. Ethan's face fell with the resigned acceptance of a child accustomed to coming in second to corporate emergencies. "Can I come back?" The question stopped her mid-motion. "Can I see Emma again?" Lily grabbed Ethan's hand with the fierce possessiveness of instant friendship. "Yes, we could have a play date." Diane looked at Marcus, expecting deflection, polite excuses that preserved proper boundaries between their worlds, billionaires and whatever this man did for a living in flannel shirts with scarred hands. Instead, he pulled a worn business card from his wallet and offered it to her between 2 fingers. The cardstock was cream-colored, professionally printed, but simple to the point of austere. Marcus Webb, residential repairs, and 24/7 emergency handyman. Just a phone number and email address. No company name, no impressive titles, no credentials designed to impress or intimidate. "If you're serious, my number's on there." His voice carried no expectation, no pressure, just information offered without strings. "Fair warning, it's not a penthouse." Diane took the card because refusing would have made a scene, would have disappointed Ethan, would have revealed more than she wanted this stranger to see about how little practice she had accepting anything resembling genuine human connection. "Thank you for letting Ethan join you." "Anytime." Marcus's smile was small, genuine, the expression of someone whose generosity cost nothing because he'd already paid every price that mattered. It's nice to share dinner with someone who appreciates the twirly thing. Ethan giggled, an actual giggle, the sound so unexpected and purely joyful that Diane paused, despite urgency screaming through every nerve. When had she last made her son laugh? She rested her hand on Ethan's shoulder, feeling how small he still was beneath expensive clothes and excellent posture, how fragile under the weight of expectations she'd loaded onto shoulders not yet broad enough to carry them. "Come on, sweetheart. We really do have to go." Ethan hugged Lily goodbye with fierce enthusiasm that spoke of connection forged in minutes, but already precious. The little girl hugged back just as hard, two children recognizing something in each other that adults had forgotten how to name. As Diane guided her son toward Sterling Heights' exit, she glanced back once. Marcus had returned to his dinner, to his daughter, to their small corner of warmth in a restaurant designed to showcase wealth and power and all the things that mattered less than she'd spent 15 years pretending they did. He didn't watch her leave. Didn't seem to care that Diane Harrington, billionaire CEO, had just shared his table and found it more nourishing than anything money could buy. The indifference should have been refreshing. Instead, it felt like the loneliest thing in the world. The car ride to Harrington Global took 14 minutes. Ethan spent 13 of them staring out the window, twirling an invisible fork in his hands with the careful attention of someone practicing a skill that suddenly mattered more than French conjugation or advanced mathematics. Diane spent those same minutes reviewing Nathan's briefing notes on her tablet, preparing arguments, building the fortress of logic that would let her walk into that boardroom and demolish Gerald Sinclair's coup before it could take root in soil fertilized by 6 weeks of careful cultivation. "Mama?" The question pulled her attention from projected quarterly earnings and strategic countermeasures. "Yes, sweetheart." "Why don't you ever cut my food?" Her fingers stilled on the tablet. Outside, Manhattan blurred past in layers of light and lives and stories she would never know, would never need to know. Except here was her son asking a question that felt like standing on the edge of something vast and dark. "Because you're capable of doing it yourself." "But Papa cuts Emma's food, and she's younger than me." The careful use of Papa instead of Mr. Webb or that man sent warning signals through Diane's executive training. Her son was already building attachment to a stranger based on 7 minutes of pasta and basic kindness. "Every family does things differently, Ethan." "But," his voice dropped to something barely audible, words meant more for window glass than mothers. "It looked nice, the way he did it, like he was taking care of her." "I take care of you." The words came automatically, defense mechanisms older than Ethan himself, built during pregnancy when Diane had learned she'd be doing this alone, refined during 8 years of proving that single mothers could run empires if they simply refused to acknowledge any alternative. "I know." Ethan pressed his forehead against the window, breath fogging glass in small clouds of warmth against cold. "It's just different." Diane wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to defend all the ways she'd sacrificed, all the hours she'd worked to ensure Ethan had everything money could buy. The best schools, finest clothes, opportunities most children couldn't imagine. But the car was already pulling up to Harrington Global's tower, and Nathan was texting crisis updates that required immediate response, and there wasn't time for conversations that led to places she couldn't control. "I'll be home late tonight." She heard the familiar script emerging from her mouth, words worn smooth by repetition. "Miss Patterson will put you to bed." Ethan nodded without looking at her, acceptance carved deep by years of practice. Okay. Diane kissed the top of his head, brief, efficient, maternal in the way that checked boxes without requiring emotional investment that might compromise the armor necessary for boardroom warfare. Be good.
Mama?
She was already halfway out of the car, mind racing through strategy and counter-strategy, defenses and attacks, all the chess moves required to survive the next 2 hours. Yes? Can we really see Emma again? And Mr. Webb? Diane looked at her son's hopeful face and felt something crack wider in her chest, the same fissure that had started at Sterling Heights when Ethan asked a stranger to cut his pasta like care was something you could request instead of something you earned through perfect behavior and excellent grades. We'll see. It was the answer she always gave when she meant no, but didn't want to deal with disappointment until later, when someone else could manage the emotional fallout while she focused on things that generated quarterly returns and shareholder value. Ethan's face shuttered closed with the practiced efficiency of a child who'd learned to translate "we'll see" into "never" and accept it without complaint because complaints made everything harder for everyone. Okay. He retreated into careful politeness that made him so easy to manage, so simple to delegate, so perfectly convenient for a mother who measured success in market capitalization instead of moments. Diane told herself it was for the best as she rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. Told herself this as she walked into the boardroom where 12 pairs of eyes tracked her entrance with predatory interest. Told herself this as Gerald Sinclair smiled his shark smile and began his presentation about why Diane Harrington was no longer fit to lead the company bearing her name. She almost believed it, until her vision started to blur at the edges and her heart began beating in patterns that didn't make sense. The walls of the boardroom started closing in with the weight of every sacrifice she'd made, every moment she'd chosen empire over presence, every night she'd kissed Ethan's forehead and left him with staff because companies couldn't run themselves. The last thing Diane remembered before darkness took her was Gerald Sinclair's voice, smooth and satisfied. As you can see, Miss Harrington's recent behavior demonstrates a concerning lack of focus. Perhaps it's time we considered. Then the floor rushed up to meet her, and the world went black. Diane woke to fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell of corporate medical facilities. Her head throbbed with the particular pain that came from bodies pushed beyond sustainable limits. Her mouth tasted like metal and regret. A hand pressed gently against her shoulder, keeping her from sitting up too fast, with the confident touch of someone who'd prevented this exact mistake countless times before. Easy. You're okay. Just breathe. The voice was familiar, calm, steady in a way that didn't match the chaos of the board meeting she vaguely remembered. Diane's vision cleared enough to recognize the man sitting beside her medical cot. Marcus Webb. What? Her voice came out hoarse, scraped raw by unconsciousness and the screaming her body had been doing that her mind had refused to hear. What are you doing here? Making sure you don't try to stand up before your blood pressure stabilizes. He released her shoulder but stayed close, monitoring with the kind of attention that spoke of training she didn't understand. How do you feel? Confused? Diane tried to sit up. The room tilted with nauseating enthusiasm. Marcus's hand returned to her shoulder, not forceful, just present, a physical reminder that gravity still applied regardless of net worth. Where's Ethan? With Emma and your building security. They're fine. His voice carried the particular calm that came from emergency rooms and late-night crises, situations where panic helped no one and competence saved lives. Playing some game involving imaginary dragons and very serious strategy discussions. Diane's mind struggled to assemble coherent timeline from fragments. Board meeting, Gerald's attack, darkness, Marcus appearing like some kind of guardian angel in flannel shirts who fixed broken things, including apparently unconscious CEOs. The board meeting is on hold. Marcus's voice stayed level, professional, the tone of someone delivering medical updates to families who needed facts without emotional decoration. You collapsed. Your CFO called emergency services, but you were already coming around by the time they arrived. I don't understand. How did you? I was in the building. Different meeting. Wrong place, right time. The explanation was too convenient, too perfectly timed. Raising questions Diane's throbbing head couldn't quite formulate into coherent suspicion. When's the last time you ate something? Marcus asked with the clinical detachment of someone conducting diagnosis rather than making small talk. This morning, I think. What did you eat? Coffee? She tried to remember breakfast, came up blank, except for the familiar weight of a ceramic mug and the bitter taste that fueled 12-hour days. Maybe a protein bar? That's not food, that's fuel. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his voice sharpened with the particular edge of medical professionals who'd seen this pattern too many times. When's the last time you slept? Really slept, more than 4 hours? Diane's silence answered for her. Marcus stood, moving to the small counter where someone had left bottled water and what looked like hospital crackers, the kind designed for nausea and low blood sugar, and bodies that had forgotten how to process actual sustenance. He brought them back with efficient movements that spoke of muscle memory, from years spent in environments where this exact scenario played out with regularity. Drink, small sips. I don't take orders from strangers who cut your son's pasta. Marcus's half-smile was tired around the edges, worn by experience that had taught him when to push and when to simply wait. Consider it a suggestion from someone who's seen stress collapse before. Drink. Diane drank because arguing required energy she didn't have, because her body was screaming for liquid, because something about this man's steady competence made resistance feel more exhausting than compliance. The water was cold, clean, necessary in ways that went beyond simple hydration. Better. Marcus nodded after she'd finished half the bottle. Now the crackers. I'm not hungry. Your body disagrees. He pressed the package into her hand with gentle insistence. Eat. This time, Diane didn't argue. The crackers tasted like cardboard and survival, like every compromise required to keep functioning when systems started failing. Through the medical room's glass wall, she could see Nathan pacing with phone pressed to his ear, his expression cycling through worry and calculation and the particular stress of a CFO watching his CEO collapse during the most important board meeting of their careers. Beyond him, the hallway was full of executives pretending not to hover while absolutely hovering, vultures circling wounded prey and wondering whether this was the moment everything changed. The meeting, Diane tried again, needing information more than she needed rest. I need to. You need to sit here and recover. Marcus's voice carried authority that didn't require volume, the command of someone accustomed to being obeyed because lives depended on it. Whatever's happening in that boardroom can wait 30 minutes. You don't understand. There's a coup. Gerald Sinclair is trying to remove me. Then he's an idiot. Marcus settled back into the chair beside her cot with the ease of someone comfortable waiting. But he's not wrong about one thing. Diane's spine stiffened despite her body's exhausted protest, ready to defend against whatever judgment was coming from this stranger who'd somehow become the person preventing her from doing what needed to be done. What? You can't run an empire if you're running on empty. He met her glare without flinching, steady as stone under scrutiny that had made grown men reconsider their life choices. When's the last time you took a full breath? When's the last time you sat down for a meal that lasted longer than 10 minutes? When's the last time you did anything that wasn't about survival? You don't know anything about my life. I know you collapsed in a boardroom at 7:45 on a Tuesday. Marcus's voice stayed steady, delivering truth without cruelty, but also without softening edges designed to protect egos from necessary impact. I know your son asked a stranger to cut his food because he's hungry for attention you're too exhausted to give. I know you're fighting so hard to keep everything together that you're forgetting what you're fighting for. The words landed like bullets, precise, devastating, impossible to deflect because they struck targets she'd spent years pretending didn't exist. How dare you? I dare because nobody else will. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes holding hers with uncomfortable compassion that refused to look away from damage it was inflicting. I dare because I've been where you are. Different circumstances, same mistake. And I learned the hard way that being strong isn't the same as being whole. Diane wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the ways he was wrong, all the reasons her situation was different, all the impossible choices that came with territory she'd inherited and responsibilities she'd accepted and legacies she couldn't afford to fail. But the fluorescent lights were too bright and her head hurt, and somewhere beyond this medical room, her son was playing with a little girl whose father had time to cut her pasta into perfect pieces and teach her that care could be something freely given instead of earned through excellence. I don't have a choice. The admission escaped as a whisper, too quiet to be considered weakness, but too honest to be considered strength. Everyone has a choice. Marcus's voice gentled without losing its edge. Question is whether you're brave enough to make it. Before Diane could respond, before she could defend or deflect or deploy any of the dozen strategies that had served her well in boardrooms but failed spectacularly in conversations requiring actual vulnerability, Nathan burst through the door with the explosive energy of a CFO who'd spent 30 minutes watching his entire world teeter on the edge of catastrophe. Thank God you're okay. He glanced at Marcus with the kind of dismissal reserved for people who didn't matter in important spaces, furniture to be worked around rather than acknowledged. We need to talk. Sinclair is circling and the board wants answers about your episode. Give us a minute, Diane said. Nathan blinked, confusion warring with urgency across features that had forgotten what no from Diane Harrington sounded like. Diane, this can't wait. I said give us a minute. Her CFO's mouth opened, closed, opened again, like a fish discovering air. Then he nodded and retreated back through the glass door, hovering close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to approximate privacy. Diane turned back to Marcus, studying this stranger who'd somehow become the person delivering truth in a building full of people paid to tell her what she wanted to hear. Who are you, really? Someone who's made different choices. He stood, checking his watch with the ease of a man whose schedule was his own to control. I should get Emma home. School night. You were in this building for a meeting. The pieces were starting to assemble themselves despite her throbbing head. What kind of meeting? Consulting work. Nothing important. What kind of consulting? Marcus's smile was small, tired, edged with the particular weariness of someone who'd learned that important people rarely cared about work done with hands instead of spreadsheets. The kind that pays enough to keep the lights on and buy good pasta. He moved toward the door, pausing with one hand on the handle. Your son's a good kid. Smart, kind, hungry for connection. His eyes found hers one last time. Don't let your empire eat what matters most. You don't understand what I'm up against. You're right. I don't. Marcus's hand rested on the door handle, but he didn't open it yet, didn't quite release her from whatever spell honest conversation cast when deployed without agenda. But I understand what you stand to lose, and I promise you, no boardroom victory is worth that price. He left before Diane could respond, before she could ask what he meant, or how he knew, or why his opinion about her life choices should matter when he was just a handyman in a flannel shirt who happened to be good with pasta and gentle with children. Through the glass, she watched him collect Emma and Ethan from where they'd been playing under security's watchful eye. Watched Emma hug Ethan goodbye with fierce affection that spoke of friendship forged fast and held tight. Watched Ethan cling just a moment longer than necessary, already mourning something he'd barely found. Watched Marcus ruffle her son's hair with casual affection, the kind of touch that said, "You matter," without requiring words or credentials or proof of worth beyond simple existence. Then they were gone, disappearing into the elevator with the ease of people whose worth wasn't measured in quarterly reports or stock prices, or the particular math that said billionaires and handymen occupied different universes that shouldn't collide. Nathan appeared again immediately, crisis updates ready to deploy. We have maybe 15 minutes before Sinclair consolidates enough votes. You need to get back in there. Diane stood. The room tilted, then steadied, her body remembering how to function even when her mind wanted nothing more than to chase after Marcus Webb and ask him to teach her whatever magic let him cut pasta with the same hands that apparently fixed broken things and still had energy left over for actual human connection. What's his play? Nathan handed her a folder thick with documents, counter-arguments, strategies refined during the 30 minutes she'd been unconscious. Claiming you're unstable. Using tonight's collapse as evidence you can't handle the pressure. He's got Thompson and Richards on his side, probably Martinez too. That's 4 votes. He needs 6 for majority. He's working on it. Diane took the folder, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had failed. Inside were speeches, statistics, rebuttals, everything she needed to walk back into that boardroom and demolish Gerald Sinclair's coup with surgical precision. Everything except the answer to the question Marcus had left hanging in the air between them. What are you fighting for? Marcus said I need to fight smarter, not harder. The words escaped before her filter caught them. Nathan stared at her like she'd started speaking Mandarin. Who? Never mind. Diane smoothed her dress, checked her reflection in the medical room's small mirror. The woman staring back looked hollow around the eyes, brittle at the edges, held together by willpower and excellent tailoring, and the particular desperation that came from having nothing left to lose, except everything. Let's go destroy Gerald Sinclair. That's the Diane I know. Nathan's relief was palpable, the comfort of returning to familiar territory where problems could be solved through superior strategy and ruthless execution. But as they walked back toward the boardroom where 12 board members waited to decide her fate, Diane's hand slipped into her pocket and found Marcus Webb's business card. Simple cream cardstock, no impressive credentials, just a phone number and the implicit promise that somewhere in this city, there existed a man who knew how to fix things that were broken. She wondered what he'd say if she called, and asked whether he fixed people too. Whether hands scarred from work could somehow repair damage done by work's absence. Whether someone who'd learned to cut pasta properly could teach a billionaire CEO how to feed her own son. The boardroom doors loomed ahead. Gerald Sinclair waited inside with his coup assembled and his confidence high. Diane's empire balanced on a knife's edge. 15 years of sacrifice threatening to collapse because she'd spent 7 minutes having dinner with her son. She thought about Ethan's face when he'd successfully twirled pasta, about Marcus's patient hands guiding small fingers through motions that transformed food into care. About Lily's giggle and Lily's declaration that everyone deserves to learn the twirly thing. Diane Harrington walked back into the boardroom with her armor in place and her weapons sharp. But somewhere under the titanium shell she'd built to survive in a world that devoured weakness, something had begun to crack. And she wasn't sure whether that terrified her or offered the first real hope she'd felt in years. Joe's Diner had been serving coffee to Wall Street's blue-collar workers since 1978. It sat 3 blocks from Harrington Global's tower, but might as well have been a different planet. Formica counters scarred by decades of ceramic mugs, vinyl booths patched with duct tape that had given up pretending to match the original color, coffee poured into heavy cups by a waitress who'd seen every kind of morning crisis humanity could manufacture. DA Diane arrived at 7 sharp, 15 minutes before the board meeting that would either confirm her survival or formalize her execution. She'd spent the previous night reviewing Nathan's briefing materials, rehearsing arguments, building defenses against attacks she could see coming and several she couldn't. Sleep had been theoretical. Ethan had asked 3 times whether they could really see Emma again before finally accepting another, "We'll see," and retreating into the careful silence that made him so easy to forget about. Marcus sat in the back booth, a red toolbox open on the table beside a coffee that had clearly gone cold while he'd been working on something hidden from view. He looked up as she approached, no surprise in his expression, despite the fact that billionaire CEOs didn't typically frequent establishments where the breakfast special cost $6 and still somehow felt overpriced. "You came." "You gave me your card." Diane slid into the booth across from him, suddenly conscious of her suit. Armani, tailored, armor designed to intimidate board members and signal dominance. Here, it just made her look like someone who'd gotten spectacularly lost on the way to somewhere important. "I assume that meant you expected me to use it." "Expected is a strong word. Hoped, maybe." He closed the toolbox with a soft click, revealing what he'd been working on, a small wooden jewelry box with a broken hinge, the kind of repair most people would throw away rather than bother fixing. "Coffee?" Before she could answer, Betty materialized with a pot and a mug, pouring without asking because, in places like Joe's, refusal wasn't an option. "Black, right?" Marcus nodded toward the steaming liquid. "You don't strike me as someone who dilutes things." "How would you know what strikes me as anything? We've met once." "Twice now. And people tell you everything you need to know if you pay attention." He pushed the toolbox toward her across scarred formica. Inside sat a wrench, a screwdriver, and a piece of paper folded into careful quarters. "Tools for your fight today." Diane unfolded the paper, reading handwriting that managed to be both precise and hurried, like someone who'd learned to write field notes during emergencies. "Tools for your fight. 1. Tighten what's loose, your resolve. 2. Remove what's stripped, Gerald. 3. Build something new." She looked up to find him watching her with that same steady calm that had monitored her recovery yesterday.
the patience of someone comfortable waiting for understanding to arrive at its own pace. You're seriously giving me a handyman metaphor before the most important meeting of my career? Boardrooms are like plumbing. Marcus picked up his cold coffee, drank it anyway with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that warmth was negotiable, but caffeine was not. Find the blockage, clear it, restore flow.
The principles are universal. Gerald Sinclair isn't a clogged pipe. No, he's a stripped bolt, threading worn out, can't hold anything in place anymore, needs to be removed before he damages the whole system. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the weight of 15 years threatening to collapse, Diane felt her mouth quirk into something almost resembling a smile. "Did you rehearse this?" "Got up at 5 to write it down before I forgot." He gestured toward the paper still in her hands. "Turns out metaphors are harder than actual repairs. With plumbing, you just need the right tool. With people, you need the right words, and those are always in short supply when you actually need them." The waitress returned with plates neither of them had ordered, eggs, toast, hash browns that glistened with enough grease to lubricate machinery. Betty set them down with the authority of someone who'd decided these two needed feeding whether they wanted it or not. Marcus picked up his fork like this was normal, like sharing breakfast with billionaires in dive diners was just another Tuesday. "You know why I carry tools everywhere?" He cut into eggs with the same careful attention he'd brought to Lily's pasta. "Because broken things don't fix themselves. But they're also not unfixable. Most things just need the right tool and someone patient enough to use it correctly." I don't need a pep talk from a handyman who makes $52,000 a year and lives in a Bronx walk-up. He didn't look up from his plate. "Yeah, I know. But here's the thing about fixing stuff for a living. You learn that a $5 tool with knowledge beats a $500 tool without it. Tools don't make the craftsman. The craftsman makes the tools matter." The words settled into silence, punctuated by the diner's ambient noise. Other early risers fueling up before their own battles, conversations about rent and overtime and all the mathematics that govern lives lived paycheck to paycheck. Diane picked up her fork, discovered she was actually hungry for the first time in days. "When's the last time you fixed something that stayed fixed?" Marcus considered this while chewing, the kind of pause that suggested he was actually thinking rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. "First faucet after I quit medicine. Took me 4 tries. Flooded the bathroom twice. Lily cried because she thought I was incompetent." His voice carried the weight of memory without drowning in it. "But attempt 5 worked. Been working ever since. Sometimes the first draft fails. Sometimes the 5th draft fails. You keep trying until you find the approach that fits the specific problem in front of you." The board meeting isn't a faucet. No, it's harder. Faucets don't have egos or personal agendas, but the principle holds. You find what's not working, you try different approaches until something clicks into place. He set down his fork, met her eyes with directness that felt like a challenge wrapped in concern. "What are you actually afraid of here? Losing the company or losing the excuse?" The question landed like a punch to solar plexus. Excuse for what? For not having to choose between empire and everything else. Marcus leaned back against vinyl that creaked under his weight. As long as you're fighting for survival, you don't have to ask whether survival is worth what it costs. Gerald's giving you an enemy. Enemies are easier than accountability. Diane's fingers tightened around her coffee mug hard enough that ceramic threatened structural integrity. "You don't know anything about—" "I know you collapsed from not eating. I know your son doesn't remember the last time you cut his food.
I know you're terrified. His voice stayed level, clinical detachment of someone delivering diagnosis without emotional investment in whether the patient accepted treatment. Not of losing the company, of losing Ethan's respect when you fail. The truth of it stole her breath. If I lose this fight, I lose everything my father built, everything I've spent 15 years protecting. And if you win? What do you win? Marcus pushed his plate aside, giving her his full attention in a way that felt both generous and dangerous. Another year of collapsing in boardrooms? Another year of Ethan asking strangers to care about him because his mother's too exhausted to notice he exists. That's not fair. Fair would be if someone had told you this years ago, before you'd invested so much in a system designed to break you. He pulled something from his wallet, not a business card this time, but a small photograph, edges worn from handling. A woman with dark hair and Lily's smile holding an infant against her chest in a hospital bed, exhausted and radiant and alive in ways that photographs couldn't quite capture, but somehow did anyway. That's Sarah. 6 hours before she died. Diane stared at the photo, at the woman who'd given Marcus the daughter he fed with such careful patience, at the happiness that had no idea it was about to end. I'm sorry. Me too. He tucked the photo back into his wallet with the care of someone handling religious artifacts. I was in surgery when she started seizing. Pulmonary embolism. By the time I got to her room, she was gone, and Lily was in the NICU, and I had 17 hours left on my shift. You finished the shift? 3 more surgeries. I was good at compartmentalizing. The past tense carried weight of entire worlds discarded. Thought if I just stayed busy enough, productive enough, successful enough, the grief couldn't catch me. Worked 80, 90, sometimes 100 hours a week. Had a nanny, had systems, had everything optimized for maximum efficiency. He paused, fingers drumming against Formica in patterns that suggested old habits dying hard. Then I collapsed during a hernia repair. Simple procedure, routine enough I could have done it drunk. But I'd been awake 36 hours and my hands started shaking, and I had to step back and let my attending finish while I recovered in the break room where I'd lectured dozens of residents about self-care and work-life balance. What did you do? Sat there for an hour, watching my hands shake and asking myself what the hell I was doing. Went home that night, held Lily for the first time in weeks, really held her, not just the quick hug before rushing out. She didn't know her favorite lullaby because I'd never sung it. The nanny had, hundreds of times, but I'd never actually participated in the bedtime routine I was paying someone else to execute perfectly. Marcus picked up his coffee, drank the last cold swallow like penance. I quit 2 weeks later. Walked away from a career I'd spent 12 years building, from a salary that could have bought Lily every advantage money provides. Started learning plumbing from YouTube videos and trial and error that flooded my bathroom more times than I want to admit. Do you regret it? Leaving medicine? Every day. The honesty was brutal, unvarnished truth offered without expectation of comfort. But I regret more the year I spent being Lily's ghost parent. She doesn't remember her mother. She deserves to at least remember her father. Diane's phone erupted against the table, Nathan with updates that couldn't wait, Gerald making moves that required counter-moves, the familiar choreography of corporate warfare that had consumed every waking hour for 15 years. She silenced it without reading.
I don't know how to do what you did. Just walk away from everything I've built. I'm not asking you to walk away. I'm asking you what you're walking toward. Marcus stood, leaving cash on the table for both their meals, despite Diane's automatic reach for her wallet. The meeting's in 40 minutes. You've got Nathan's briefing, you know Gerald's angles. You'll probably win because you're smarter and tougher and more ruthless than he'll ever be. He picked up his toolbox, balanced it against his hip with the ease of someone who'd carried tools longer than he'd carried scalpels. Question is whether winning this fight costs you the war. Whether Ethan's still going to recognize you when you're done bleeding for a company that'll replace you 5 minutes after you're gone. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand perfectly. I just think you're fighting for the wrong thing. He headed for the door, paused with one hand on the frame. One more thing. Can I pick Ethan up from school today? Teach him to change a tire? The request was so absurd, so perfectly timed to derail every thought currently fighting for dominance in Diane's overwhelmed mind that she almost laughed. Why would you do that? Because he asked. Yesterday, in the elevator while you were talking to security. Wanted to know if I could teach him dad stuff. Marcus's expression softened into something that looked like sympathy, edged with challenge. I told him only if his mom approved. Because I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm just showing up when someone asks for help. Diane thought about Ethan's biological father in San Francisco, building startups and sending child support checks, but never visiting, never calling, never demonstrating that fatherhood was anything more than a financial obligation cleared through lawyers. His father hasn't called in 3 years. Then he's an idiot, because that kid's worth more than any company. Marcus held her gaze, waiting for answer to questions she'd never expected to face in a diner at 7 a.m. before the fight of her professional life. If you're willing? Yes. Please. The smile that transformed his face was small but genuine, the expression of someone whose generosity cost nothing because the math was already settled. I'll text you updates. He's safe with me. Then he was gone, disappearing into Manhattan's early morning crowds, leaving Diane alone with cold coffee and the uncomfortable realization that she'd just entrusted her son to a man whose last name she'd learned yesterday and whose competence she'd evaluated based entirely on pasta twirling and the way he'd prevented her from standing too fast after fainting. Betty materialized to refill her cup without asking. That one's good people. The waitress nodded toward the door Marcus had exited. Been coming here 5 years. Always tips 20% even when he's counting change. You could do worse. It's not like that. Sure it's not. Betty's smile suggested she'd seen this particular denial play out countless times, always with the same ending. Good luck with your meeting, honey. Kick their asses. Diane arrived at Harrington Global with 20 minutes to spare. Nathan met her in the lobby with updates that felt designed to induce panic. Gerald had secured Martinez, Thompson was wavering, Richards had stopped returning calls, which meant he'd probably already flipped. The boardroom felt different when she entered at 8:55. Same leather chairs, same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that never stopped consuming itself. But the air carried weight it hadn't yesterday, potential energy waiting for catalyst to convert into kinetic destruction. Gerald sat at the far end, her father's old seat, the one she'd never claimed because symbolism mattered less than strategy. He'd arranged his materials with the confidence of a man who'd already won, who was just waiting for everyone else to acknowledge reality. Thompson and Richards flanked him like bookends carved from corporate loyalty that lasted exactly as long as winning remained possible. Martinez sat 2 chairs down,
eyes carefully neutral in a way that confirmed Nathan's intelligence about votes already committed. 4 board members guaranteed. Gerald needed 3 more for majority control. Diane didn't sit. Standing gave her height advantage, forced them to look up, shifted power dynamics in ways that mattered even when outcomes felt predetermined. "Gentlemen," she set her bag on the table with deliberate calm, "I apologize for yesterday's interruption."
No need to apologize for a medical emergency. Gerald's voice dripped synthetic concern like honey laced with arsenic. Though it does raise questions about your capacity to handle leadership pressures.
I'm sure it does.
Diane remained standing, letting silence stretch until discomfort began to ripple. Just as I'm sure you've spent the last 24 hours explaining to our board members why temporary low blood pressure somehow disqualifies me from running the company my father built. Your father built this company on strength. Gerald leaned back, fingers steepled in the universal gesture of men who mistook posturing for power. On unwavering focus and uncompromising dedication. He never would have collapsed in the middle of a critical meeting. My father died at 58 from a stress-induced heart attack in this very room. Diane's voice could have cut glass, could have performed surgery without anesthetic, could have stripped paint from walls. So perhaps we should reconsider what strength actually looks like. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Thompson cleared his throat with the discomfort of a man watching script deviate from expected lines.
Diane, no one's questioning your dedication, but recent events combined with certain distractions. He gestured vaguely, the physical manifestation of euphemisms deployed to avoid saying what everyone was thinking. It's natural for the board to have concerns. Distractions. Diane turned to face him directly. You mean my son? I mean the rumors. Thompson had the grace to look uncomfortable. About you having dinner with some random man and his child? About Ethan becoming attached to strangers? About priorities that seemed to be shifting away from Harrington Global? Ice flooded Diane's veins, the particular cold that came from realizing the game had started before she'd entered the room. I had dinner with my son. A stranger's daughter asked Ethan to join their table. I allowed it because my child showed interest in something besides scheduled activities and mandatory excellence. And the man? Gerald's smile suggested he'd been waiting for this exact opening.
The one photographed cutting your son's food like you're incapable of basic parenting? He slid his phone across polished mahogany. The screen showed a photograph Diane hadn't known existed. Their table at Sterling Heights. Marcus's hand guiding Ethan's fork. Her own face visible in profile, watching with an expression that looked almost soft, almost human. Almost like a mother who'd forgotten she was supposed to be performing maternal competence rather than learning it. The caption read, Billionaire CEO Diane Harrington cozying up to mysterious handyman while company faces crisis. New boyfriend or PR stunt? The post had 43,000 likes. The comments section was a war zone of speculation, judgment, and theories ranging from reasonable to completely unhinged. This was posted 47 minutes ago. Gerald reclaimed his phone with the satisfaction of someone playing cards he'd been holding since before the game started. It's already been picked up by 3 gossip sites, and Bloomberg is asking for comment. So forgive the board for wondering whether your judgment is perhaps becoming compromised. Nathan started to respond, but Diane raised one hand, silencing him with gesture honed by 15 years of commanding rooms full of men who thought female authority was negotiable. Who is he? Richards demanded. This Marcus Webb everyone's suddenly so interested in. Someone who taught my son to eat pasta properly. Diane picked up Gerald's phone, studied the image of herself looking at Ethan with something resembling actual attention. How that translates to compromised judgment, I'm fascinated to hear. It translates to distraction. Gerald stood, positioning himself as equal rather than subordinate, the physical manifestation of coup in progress. To a CEO who's starting to prioritize personal matters over corporate responsibility, who's making impulsive decisions,
Who's showing weakness at the exact moment this company needs strength? Weakness. Diane set the phone down with deliberate care. You want to talk about weakness? Let's talk about the emails you've been exchanging with Titan equity partners. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Gerald's face went carefully blank, the expression of poker players holding losing hands and calculating whether to fold or bluff. I don't know what. Nathan? Diane nodded toward her CFO, who'd spent the last 18 hours preparing for exactly this moment. Nathan distributed folders around the table with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting his entire career to weaponize spreadsheets and email chains against the people who'd dismissed him as harmless. At approximately 3:15 yesterday afternoon, I discovered communications between Gerald Sinclair and Titan Equity regarding a potential hostile takeover of Harrington Global. His voice carried the particular satisfaction of accountants who'd found discrepancies and traced them back to source. Communications that began 6 weeks ago. Communications that include detailed financial projections, assuming Sinclair as CEO, and a board restructure that would remove or reduce positions for everyone currently in this room, except Thompson and Richards. Papers landed in front of each board member like grenades with pins already pulled. Thompson's face went pale as bleached bone. Martinez's careful neutrality developed cracks that spread like ice under pressure. Gerald, what is this? Insurance. Gerald didn't even try to deny, which told Diane everything about how deep his preparation went, how certain he'd been that exposure wouldn't matter because the outcome was already determined. Against exactly this kind of emotional instability, this company needs leadership that puts profit over personal drama. This company needs leadership that isn't actively trying to sell it to vulture capitalists. Diane turned to Martinez, who was reading now with the kind of focus that suggested everything he'd believed was currently being revised in real time. Page 4 outlines Titan's restructure plans. 1,200 jobs eliminated in the first quarter. R&D budget cut by 40%. 3 divisions sold for parts. You are going to gut us. Martinez's voice carried betrayal and fury in equal measure. I was going to save us from management more interested in playing house with random men than protecting shareholder value. The rage building in Diane's chest was white-hot and righteous, the kind of fury that made boardrooms combustible and careers end in conflagration. But rage was what Gerald wanted. Rage made her look unstable, emotional, exactly as weak as he'd been painting her for 6 weeks. She smiled instead. This meeting is over. Gerald, you're terminated, effective immediately. Thompson, Richards, you have 24 hours to decide whether you'd like to join him or explain to the SEC why you were aware of attempted corporate sabotage and failed to report it. She gathered her materials with movements designed to signal finality. Everyone else, I'll expect your written commitment to this company by 9 tomorrow morning. You can't fire me. Gerald stood, papers scattering. I have a contract. You have a morality clause that prohibits actions harmful to company interests. Diane's voice could have frozen nitrogen. Attempting to orchestrate a hostile takeover while serving on the board seems to qualify. Nathan, please have security escort Mr. Sinclair from the building. This isn't over. Gerald's snarl carried the impotent fury of powerful men discovering their power had limits. That picture, that man, whatever's happening in your personal life,
It's going to destroy you. You can't be Diane Harrington and play happy family with some nobody. Then I guess we'll find out what Diane Harrington is actually capable of. She held his stare until security arrived, 2 men who'd trained for exactly this scenario, who removed Gerald with professional efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first boardroom extraction. Thompson and Richards left shortly after, silent and pale, calculating their next moves with the frantic energy of drowning men looking for debris to cling to. The remaining board members filed out with murmured assurances of support that would need verification in writing, but felt genuine enough for the moment. Finally, Diane was alone with Nathan. That was either brilliant or suicidal. Her CFO looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last hour. Possibly both. It was necessary. Diane sank into the nearest chair, adrenaline draining to leave exhaustion in its wake. The picture. Damage control? Already working on it.
We'll frame it as you mentoring a single father. Corporate responsibility, humanizing the brand. Don't. The word came out harder than intended. Don't turn it into a PR strategy. Nathan blinked with the confusion of a man watching his boss deviate from 15 years of consistent pattern. Diane, we have to control the narrative. The narrative is that I had dinner with my son and he made a friend. That's it. No spin, no strategy, no corporate messaging. She met his stare, watching him try to solve an equation that had suddenly stopped making sense. Tell damage control to say no comment and let it die naturally. That's not how you've ever handled media before. I know. Silence stretched while Nathan recalibrated, running scenarios and calculating outcomes with the speed of processors designed for exactly this kind of crisis mathematics. Who is he, this Marcus Webb? Diane pulled out her phone, found the photo she'd taken without thinking yesterday. Ethan's face bright with achievement as he held that perfect spiral of pasta, pride and joy mixing into something she couldn't remember seeing in months. Someone who taught my son he's capable. Someone who showed me what I've been missing. She looked up from her screen. Which is everything that matters. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the particular intensity of someone trying to decode messages written in unfamiliar languages. You know, if you pursue this, whatever this is, Gerald was right. The media will eviscerate you. Let them. Your father would have. My father died because he chose this company over everything else. Diane stood, gathering her things with automatic efficiency born of thousands of identical exits. I'm not sure his approval is the metric I want to chase anymore. She left Nathan in the boardroom, walked to her office, closed the door behind her, and stood at windows overlooking Manhattan stretched out like circuit boards. Millions of lives conducting electricity through paths of least resistance toward destinations most never questioned. Her phone buzzed. Marcus, texting from what the background suggested was Riverside Park in Brooklyn. Ethan's learning to change a bike tire. Kid's got good hands. Patient. Reminds me of surgical residents who actually listen instead of just waiting to talk. Picking him up from school at 3. That still work? Diane typed back before strategy could intervene. Yes, thank you. For everything. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. No thanks needed. This is what showing up looks like. She stood at that window for another 10 minutes, watching the city move and breathe and consume itself in the endless cycle of commerce that never stopped, never rested, never questioned whether motion equaled progress or just exhaustion with better marketing. Then she did something she hadn't done in 8 years of running Harrington Global. She left the office at noon, drove herself to Brooklyn in the car she owned but never drove because drivers were more efficient, and found Riverside Park, where Marcus was teaching her son to patch a bicycle tube using water and patience, and the kind of attention that couldn't be bought or delegated or optimized. Ethan saw her first, face transforming with surprise that quickly became delight.
Mama, you're here! Mr. Webb is teaching me to find leaks by watching for bubbles.
Marcus looked up from where he knelt beside an upturned bicycle, grease on his hands, and what looked like genuine pleasure in his expression at her arrival. Thought you had an empire to run. It'll survive an afternoon without me. Diane approached slowly, conscious of her heels on grass, her suit among jeans and flannel, the ways she didn't fit into this space where her son was learning that broken things deserved repair. Or it won't. Either way, I'm here. How'd the meeting go? I won. Fired Gerald. Probably made enemies I'll regret. She watched Ethan carefully lower the patched tube into a bucket of water, his small hands mimicking Marcus's motions with concentration that made her chest tight. But I'm starting to think winning and losing are the wrong metrics. Marcus stood, wiped his hands on a rag that had probably been clean sometime in the distant past. What are the right metrics? Before Diane could answer, Ethan shouted with triumph that echoed across the playground.
I found it! The bubbles! Right there!
Mark it with the chalk. Marcus handed over a piece of white chalk that lived in his eternally present toolbox. Circle it so you remember where to patch. Her son followed instructions with the focus he usually reserved for standardized tests and piano recitals, achievements that generated praise, but never this kind of joy. The right metric, Diane heard herself say, is whether my son still recognizes me when I'm done fighting for things that'll replace me 5 minutes after I'm gone. Marcus's smile was small, but carried weight of understanding that went beyond words. That's probably the smartest thing I've heard from a CEO in 5 years of fixing their buildings while they ignored the people working in them. They stood side by side, watching Ethan learn that patience and attention could transform broken things into functional ones, that competence came from practice rather than innate talent, that sometimes the best education happened on grass in Brooklyn parks rather than mahogany-paneled classrooms where tuition cost more than most families earned. Diane's phone buzzed, Bloomberg wanting comment, Nathan with updates. The world demanding she return to being the person she'd spent 15 years becoming. She silenced it without reading. Can I ask you something? Marcus kept his eyes on Ethan, but the question was clearly for her. Yes? Am I your redemption project? The working-class guy who helps you prove you're human? The question was brutal in its honesty, in its willingness to name the thing Diane had been carefully not examining. She thought about lying, thought about the dozen diplomatic answers that would preserve feelings and maintain comfortable distance, thought about all the ways truth was negotiable when relationships were transactions. A month ago? Honest answer, yes. You were a project. She forced herself to look at him while delivering verdict. I saw you as evidence. Evidence I could change. Evidence Ethan could have a male role model. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt, didn't run, just stood there, absorbing truth like rain. But then you gave back my check. You demanded to be hired properly instead of saved. Diane took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. You taught me the difference between charity and respect, between helping and patronizing, between seeing people and cataloging their utility. She reached for his hand before courage could fail, found it warm and scarred and steady. Now you're the person I call when I need courage, when I need truth, when I need to remember what real looks like. Her voice dropped to something barely above whisper. That's not a project.
That's a partner.
If you'll have me. Marcus was quiet for so long. Diane began cataloging exit strategies, planning damage control, preparing for rejection delivered with the same honesty he'd brought to every other uncomfortable truth. I'm terrified you'll get bored. His voice was rough, abraded by fear he wasn't quite managing to conceal. That once the novelty wears off, you'll realize I'm just a guy with a toolbox making $52,000 a year. That I can't compete with your world. I don't want that world anymore. The certainty surprised her even as she spoke it. It nearly killed me. I want the world where my son learns to fix things, where I make terrible pancakes, where someone tells me the truth, even when it's hard. She stepped closer, closing distance that felt both vast and negligible. You're not competing with anything, Marcus. You're the only thing that feels real. He kissed her then, gentle, tentative, tasting like coffee and promises neither of them was quite ready to make, but couldn't quite resist testing.
From across the playground, Ethan's voice carried pure delight. Finally! Lily owes me $5! They broke apart, Diane's face flushing with embarrassment, and something else she couldn't quite name, but recognized as dangerous and precious in equal measure. You bet on us? Ethan jogged over, grinning with the satisfaction of a child who'd called something correctly despite adult skepticism. Lily said it would take forever. I said 2 weeks. I win. Marcus laughed, the sound warm and full and completely unguarded. Kids got good instincts about people. He ruffled Ethan's hair with casual affection that made Diane's throat tight. All right, champion. Let's finish patching this tube and then your mom promised to buy me dinner, since I'm apparently dating above my tax bracket now.
I did not promise. You absolutely should, though. Marcus's grin was wicked, playful in ways Diane had forgotten men could be when they weren't trying to take things from her. I know a place that does excellent pasta. Very romantic. Check tablecloths, candles that drip wax, the works. That sounds terrible. It absolutely is. You'll love it. And despite everything, the coup she'd just survived, the media storm brewing, the uncertain future spreading out in directions she couldn't control, Diane found herself laughing. Actually laughing, the sound foreign enough that Ethan stared at her with something like wonder. Mama, you sound different. Different how? Happy. You sound happy. The observation landed with the weight of prophecy, of children naming truths adults spent lifetimes avoiding. Diane knelt down to Ethan's level, heedless of grass staining her suit, of the ways she was becoming someone she wouldn't have recognized 6 months ago. I am happy, terrified, but happy. She pulled him into a hug that felt like stepping off another cliff, like free-falling into something that might catch her or might not, but was worth the risk regardless. Thank you for asking to sit with strangers yesterday. You're braver than I've ever been. Ethan hugged back with fierce intensity that suggested he'd been waiting years for permission to need her. Over her son's shoulder, Diane watched Marcus watching them both with an expression that mixed satisfaction and something tender enough to hurt. This was insane. She'd known this man for 48 hours. She was risking everything she'd built on intuition and desperate hope and a stranger's ability to cut pasta properly. But the alternative was returning to the person who'd collapsed in boardrooms and couldn't remember her son's name. And that person had been dying slowly for 15 years. Better to risk everything on something real than succeed at something hollow. They spent the afternoon teaching Diane the basics of bicycle maintenance, how to check brake cables, how to true a wheel using spoke tension and patience. how to make something function smoothly through attention rather than replacement. Marcus proved to be a patient teacher when his student actually wanted to learn. He showed her where to place her hands, how to feel for problems through subtle resistance, the ways small adjustments compounded into significant change. Ethan narrated everything with enthusiasm bordering on manic, translating Marcus's technical explanations into 7-year-old logic that somehow made more sense than the original. At 5 o'clock, Diane's phone started ringing with the particular insistence that suggested the world had noticed her absence and decided it constituted emergency. She answered on the 4th ring, prepared for crisis. Nathan's voice carried strain that had become his default setting. Bloomberg published,
They're calling it Questions About Harrington CEO's Judgment During Crisis. It's everywhere. Diane looked at Ethan, at Marcus, at the bike they'd fixed together through collaboration and patience and willingness to get grease under their fingernails. Let them question. She heard the certainty in her own voice, recognized it as new or maybe just dormant for so long it felt like discovery. I'm done performing competence for people who mistake cruelty for strength. That's not. Diane, this is serious. Investors are calling. The board wants reassurance. Tell them I'll address it Monday. Right now, I'm having dinner with my son and learning that some things matter more than quarterly earnings. She hung up before Nathan could mount counter-argument, before strategy could replace instinct, before fear could masquerade as responsibility and convince her to abandon this fragile new thing for the familiar comfort of empire maintenance. That sounded expensive. Marcus had returned to packing his tools with the methodical care of someone for whom objects earned respect through utility. The call, I mean. Like someone telling you the building's on fire, and you just said you'd get to it later. The building's always on fire. I'm just done being the only person with a bucket. Ethan tugged her hand with urgency that suggested 7-year-olds had limited patience for adult metaphors. Can we really get pasta? With candles and everything? We really can. Diane squeezed his hand, felt him squeeze back. Lead the way, Mr. Webb. Marcus's smile could have powered the city. Now we're talking. Carmine's on the Upper West Side. Best marinara in Manhattan, and they don't care if you show up in a suit or covered in bike grease. I'm covered in bike grease. Then you'll fit right in. They took the subway because Marcus didn't own a car, and Diane's driver would have required explanations she wasn't ready to provide. The train was crowded with evening commuters, with people returning from jobs they'd left to go home to families who'd been waiting. Ethan stood pressed against Marcus, asking questions about every mechanical detail visible through the subway windows. How trains switched tracks, why some stations had 3 platforms, whether it was possible to fall onto the rails if you leaned far enough. Marcus answered each question with patient detail, never talking down, never dismissing, treating curiosity as valuable rather than inconvenient. Diane watched them and felt herself relaxing into something she couldn't name, the tension she'd carried for 15 years loosening one increment at a time, like bolts being carefully backed out. Carmine's was exactly as advertised, checkered tablecloths, wax-dripped Chianti bottles serving as candle holders, the smell of garlic and tomato sauce, and bread baked fresh enough that flour still dusted the baker's apron. They were seated at a corner table by a host who greeted Marcus by name and didn't bat an eye at the grease stains or the billionaire CEO clearly slumming for reasons he was too polite to question. Ethan ordered spaghetti with the confidence of someone who discovered a signature dish. Marcus got lasagna. Diane chose something at random because the menu had stopped mattering the moment she'd decided showing up was more important than looking like she belonged. The food arrived steaming and generous, portions designed for actual hunger rather than Instagram aesthetics. Marcus demonstrated proper pasta twirling technique again for Diane's benefit, his hands moving with practiced efficiency that came from feeding his daughter 1,000 dinners just like this. Fork at 90 degrees, spin clockwise, 4 rotations maximum, or you get a mess instead of a bite. Diane tried, failed spectacularly, tried again with slightly better results.
Ethan giggled at her incompetence with the kind of joy that suggested seeing his mother fail at something was novel enough to be delightful.
"You're worse than me, Mama." "I absolutely am. Mr. Webb is apparently a better teacher than I am a student."
"You're doing fine." Marcus's voice carried encouragement without condescension. "First time is always rough. It's muscle memory. You need repetition before it becomes automatic." They ate and talked and existed in the kind of easy silence that felt more intimate than conversation. Ethan told stories about school that Diane had never heard because she'd never asked the right questions or been present enough to receive answers. Marcus shared nothing about his past beyond what he'd already revealed, living entirely in present tense, like someone who'd learned that dwelling on what was lost cost more than it returned. Diane found herself talking about her father, not the mythical CEO who'd built an empire, but the actual man who'd missed her school plays and forgotten her birthday and died in a boardroom because he couldn't imagine any other ending. "Do you miss him?" Marcus asked when she'd wound down, when silence had settled over their table like a blanket. "I miss who I wanted him to be. The actual person? I'm not sure I ever knew him well enough to miss." Ethan leaned against her shoulder with the comfortable weight of a child who'd been given permission to need things. "I don't want you to die in your office, Mama." The statement was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of drama while being absolutely devastating, that Diane had to breathe through the shock of it before responding. "I don't want that either, sweetheart. Promise?" She looked at Marcus, who was watching her with steady calm that suggested he understood the weight of promises and wouldn't judge her for whatever answer she gave. "I promise to try. That's all anyone can do." Ethan seemed to consider this, running internal calculations about whether trying was sufficient when balanced against the specter of parental death. "Okay. But if you forget, I'll remind you." "Deal." They sealed it with a handshake that Marcus insisted on making official, gripping properly, pumping twice, maintaining eye contact like contracts required witnesses and ceremony. The bill came, and Marcus tried to pay, but Diane won that fight through the simple expedient of handing her card to the waiter while Marcus was in the bathroom. When he returned and discovered what she'd done, his expression cycled through annoyance, resignation, and finally, amusement. "I'm never going to get to pay for anything again, am I? Not while I have money and you have principles about equality." Diane signed the receipt with a tip that would have made the waiter's week. "Consider it rent for emotional labor and bicycle repair instruction. Rent implies ongoing service. You planning on keeping me around?" The question was light, but carried weight of actual inquiry beneath the teasing. Diane reached across the table, found his hand, laced their fingers together in a gesture that felt both natural and terrifying. "If you'll let me. I know this is fast. I know I'm a disaster, and you're probably crazy for even considering I'm absolutely crazy." Marcus squeezed her hand. "But I'm also tired of being smart and safe and making choices designed to minimize risk. Sometimes risk is the whole point." Ethan watched them with satisfaction that bordered on smug. "Does this mean we can see Lily again? And build that fort you promised?" "That fort is happening whether your mom and I figure this out or not." Marcus ruffled Ethan's hair. "Some promises transcend relationship status." They took the subway back to Marcus's neighborhood, Diane's penthouse suddenly feeling too far away, too sterile, too much like returning to a life she was actively trying to leave. At Marcus's building, brick facade that had been elegant in the 1940s, and was now working hard to maintain dignified. He stopped at the entrance with Lily already visible through the lobby window, waiting with the nanny who'd been texted updates all evening. "You want to come up?" Fair warning, the apartment's small and the elevator's older than both of us combined. Diane looked at Ethan, who nodded with such hopeful enthusiasm that refusing felt impossible. "We'd love to." The elevator did indeed groan its way to the third floor like a mechanical entity contemplating retirement. The hallway carpet showed wear patterns from decades of footsteps. Lives lived in proximity with thin walls and shared concerns. Marcus's apartment 3F was exactly as she'd imagined. Small, crowded with books actually read rather than displayed, Lily's artwork covering the refrigerator in layers of construction paper and tempera paint that documented a childhood in progress. Lily launched herself at Ethan with the enthusiasm of children who decided 7 hours apart constituted unacceptable separation. "Ethan, did you fix the bike? Did your mama come? Are we going to build the fort now?" Yes, and probably not tonight since it's almost bedtime." Marcus intercepted his daughter mid-launch. "But soon, Mr. Ethan and his mom are going to come over, and we'll build the biggest fort Brooklyn's ever seen." "With structural integrity?" Ethan asked with the seriousness of someone who'd been introduced to concepts and wanted to apply them correctly. "With so much structural integrity, it'll require engineering consultation." Marcus set Lily down. "But first, pajamas, and teeth, and all the other bedtime rituals that stand between us and fort construction." He disappeared down the short hallway with Lily chattering about her day, leaving Diane alone in a living room that cost less per month than she spent on shoes, but felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. Ethan gravitated toward the bookshelves, studying titles with the careful attention of a child who'd learned that books revealed truths about their owners. Diane found herself drawn to the photographs clustered on one wall. Lily as a newborn, tiny and wrinkled. Lily learning to walk. Marcus's hands hovering nearby. Lily covered in what looked like chocolate cake, laughing with pure joy at the mess she'd created. Each photo radiated presence, the kind of attention that couldn't be bought or delegated or optimized through efficiency. "Those are my favorites." Marcus had returned. Lily presumably settled in bed, or at least confined to her room. "The messy ones, where she's actually being herself instead of performing for cameras." "They're beautiful." Diane meant it. "You take them yourself?" "Mostly. I'm terrible at composition, but consistent about documenting." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel warmth radiating from his body. "Sarah used to say the best photographs are the ones that capture what people forget to hide." "I don't have any like this of Ethan." The admission came without thinking. "Everything's professional shots. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, perfect smile. Nothing real." "It's not too late to start." She turned to face him, found him closer than expected, near enough to count the variations in his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow that she'd never noticed before. "I'm terrified of this." The words escaped as whisper. "Of you." "Of what wanting this means about everything I've built." "Good." Marcus's hand came up to cup her face with gentleness that made her throat tight. "Terror means it matters. Nothing worth having is ever safe." He kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, tasting like marinara and promise, and all the futures she'd convinced herself were impossible for women who chose empires over everything else. From the living room came Ethan's voice, carefully neutral. "Should I go look at books somewhere else?" They broke apart, Diane's face flushing hot enough to power generators. "No, buddy, we're good." Marcus's laugh was warm,
unashamed of being caught. "Your mom and I are just figuring some things out." "Looks like you figured it out pretty well." Ethan's smile was pure mischief. "Lily's going to be so mad she missed this." Diane spent the next hour in Marcus's apartment learning what family looked like when built through choice rather than obligation. They read books together, negotiated bedtime with Lily through the closed door, made plans for Saturday that involved parks and tools and teaching Diane how to fix a leaky faucet. At 9 o'clock, exhaustion finally caught up with adrenaline. Marcus called Diane a car, not her usual service, but a regular taxi, because that's what people did when they didn't have drivers on retainer. At the door, Ethan hugged Marcus with fierce intensity. "Thank you for teaching me bike stuff, and for making Mama smile." "Anytime, champion. See you Saturday." Diane found herself hesitating, unwilling to leave this small apartment for the penthouse that suddenly felt more like museum than home. Thank you for everything. Thank you for taking a chance on a guy with a toolbox. Marcus kissed her forehead, the gesture tender and chaste, and somehow more intimate than anything that had come before. "Text me when you get home safe." "I will." "And Diane, whatever happens Monday with the board and Bloomberg and all of it, you're going to be fine. You fired Gerald. That took courage. The rest is just cleanup." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that surviving today meant surviving tomorrow, meant building something sustainable instead of collapsing under weight of expectations that had been unreasonable from the start. In the taxi heading back to Manhattan, Ethan fell asleep against her shoulder with the boneless surrender of childhood exhaustion. Diane held him close, breathing in the smell of his shampoo and bicycle grease, and the particular sweetness of sons who were learning that mothers could change if given reason and opportunity. Her phone buzzed. Nathan with updates, the board wanting emergency meetings, Bloomberg running a follow-up story about her judgment during crisis. She silenced it all and watched her city slide past through windows that separated her from millions of lives she'd never know, millions of choices she'd never have to make, because money insulated her from most consequences. But not all. Not the consequence of Ethan pulling away because she'd been absent too long. Not the consequence of becoming her father, brilliant, successful, dead at 58 in a boardroom because the company had consumed everything else. Not the consequence of looking in mirrors and seeing strangers who'd sacrificed humanity for market capitalization. At home, she carried Ethan to bed without waking him, a feat that required more strength than boardroom battles, but felt more important than any victory she'd won through ruthlessness. She stood in his doorway, watching him sleep, this small person she'd created and nearly lost through the sin of good intentions deployed with terrible execution. Tomorrow would bring new crises. Bloomberg's questions would multiply. Board members would demand reassurance. The empire she'd built would test whether she was serious about letting it run without her constant intervention. But tonight she'd had dinner with her son and kissed a man who fixed things for living and learned that broken bicycles deserved patience. Tonight she'd chosen presence over productivity. And if that made her unfit to lead, according to people who measured fitness in hours sacrificed and relationships destroyed, then maybe she'd been leading the wrong thing all along. Saturday arrived, wrapped in October sunshine that made Brooklyn look almost forgivable. Diane woke at 6 from habit, lay in bed until 7 from discipline she was actively trying to unlearn, and finally gave up on sleep at 7:30 when her mind started cataloging Monday's problems with the efficiency of machines that never rested. Ethan appeared in her doorway at 8, already dressed in jeans that had actual grass stains from yesterday, a transformation from the child who'd worn designer clothes like armor against a world that judged everything. "Is it time yet?" Marcus said 10. We have 2 hours. Can we make pancakes? Real ones, not the ones Chef makes that taste like air. They destroyed the kitchen, making pancakes from a mix Diane had to send the doorman out to buy because her cupboards contained everything except actual food normal people ate. The first batch burned black. The second came out raw in the middle. The third approached edible. Ethan declared them the best pancakes he'd ever had, which said terrible things about either his standards or the chef Diane paid 6 figures annually to provide nutritionally optimized meals that tasted like expensive cardboard. At 9:45, they took a taxi to Riverside Park because Diane still couldn't quite make herself take the subway on weekends, some habits dying harder than others. Marcus was already there with Lily, both of them covered in a fine layer of dust that suggested they'd been working on something structural and probably ill-advised. You came. He smiled at Diane like her arrival was unexpected gift rather than confirmed plan. You doubted? 50-50 odds. Figured you'd get a crisis call and have to bail. He gestured toward what appeared to be the skeleton of something large and unstable. But since you're here, we're building a community workshop. Diane looked at the pile of reclaimed lumber, the tools spread across grass like surgical instruments awaiting operation, the chalk lines marking dimensions on dirt. A workshop. For kids, teaching them to fix things. Marcus handed her work gloves that were 3 sizes too large. Plumbing, basic electrical, carpentry. Stuff schools don't teach anymore because we've decided the only valuable knowledge comes from textbooks. This is insane. Completely. His grin was pure mischief wrapped in purpose. Ethan, you want to help measure or you want to supervise with Lily? Her son chose measuring with the enthusiasm of children given adult responsibilities, leaving Diane standing in a Brooklyn park on Saturday morning, contemplating whether she'd lost her mind or finally found it. Marcus showed her how to use a tape measure properly, hook the end, pull taut, read where the measurement landed instead of where she wanted it to land, because reality didn't negotiate with preference. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally interrupted by Lily's commentary on fort-building principles that apparently applied to workshops as well, and Ethan's careful questions about why measurements had to be exact when approximate seemed easier. Because approximate compounds. Marcus drove a stake into ground with 3 efficient strikes. You're off by a 1/4 inch here, another 1/4 inch there. Suddenly your whole structure's crooked, and no amount of forcing makes it work right. Better to be precise from the start. Sounds like business strategy. Diane lined up the next measurement, checked it twice before calling out numbers. Sounds like life strategy. He marked the spot with chalk. Most problems start small. Ignoring them doesn't make them smaller, just harder to fix when you finally have to. They built the framework over 3 hours, Marcus demonstrating techniques Diane had never imagined she'd need. How to check for level using simple tools in physics. How to compensate for ground that wasn't perfectly flat. How to build something that would last through adjustment rather than replacement. Eaton absorbed everything like a sponge, asking questions that revealed intelligence directed toward practical application instead of academic abstraction. Lily mostly supervised, occasionally contributing observations about structural integrity that suggested Marcus had been teaching her this vocabulary since she could talk. At 1:30, they broke for lunch, sandwiches from a bodega that cost $8 total and tasted better than anything Diane's chef had ever produced. Marcus's phone rang while they were eating. He glanced at the screen, frowned, answered with the clipped efficiency of someone handling business. Web? Pause. No, I told you, Friday. The rent's covered. Longer pause, tension building in shoulders Diane was learning to read. I'll have it Monday. The hospital job clears tomorrow. He hung up with deliberate care,
the kind of control that suggested fury being carefully managed. Everything okay? Landlord.
Apparently 2 weeks late is enough to start eviction proceedings, even when you've paid on time for 5 years. Marcus's smile was tight. Remind me why I thought quitting a stable career for the romance of poverty was a good idea? The amount hit Diane like cold water. $1,400. She spent more than that on shoes she wore once. Her monthly parking garage fee was 3 times his rent. I could... No. The word came fast. Final. We're not doing that. Doing what? The thing where you solve my problems with money and I become your charity case. He started packing up lunch debris with movements sharp enough to suggest anger he was trying not to direct at her. I'm handling it. By working 3 jobs and still coming up short? By making different choices than I made when I was pulling in $380 a year. Marcus looked at her directly, no apology in his expression. I'm not poor, Diane. I'm deliberate. There's a difference.
Deliberate doesn't pay your rent.
Neither does accepting money from people I'm dating. That's how you stop being partners and start being projects. The conversation from yesterday echoed, his fear of becoming her redemption narrative, her attempt to prove she saw him as equal when the math said they inhabited different universes entirely. What if I hired you, properly, for Harrington Global's facilities? Marcus was quiet, considering implications that spread like ripples. What's the rate? Whatever's fair, you tell me. $150 an hour for residential repairs, $200 for commercial because the liability's higher. He met her eyes, checking for charity disguised as commerce. That's market rate. I won't take more just because you're trying to help. Then that's what I'll pay. Nathan can draw up a contract by Monday. Weekly billing, net 30 terms. I'm not giving discounts for dating the CEO. The corner of his mouth quirked, though I might throw in free pasta lessons. Those lessons are worth at least $250 an hour. You're probably right. I should really reconsider my pricing structure. They finished the framework by 4, the skeleton of something that would become functional through attention over time. Marcus showed Diane how to photograph it for records, not for Instagram, but for documentation that tracked progress and identified problems before they compounded. Ethan and Lily had migrated to the actual playground, building some elaborate scenario involving dragons and rescue missions that made absolutely no narrative sense but clearly worked perfectly in the logic of childhood. Diane stood beside Marcus, both of them watching their children play with the particular satisfaction of parents who'd managed to not screw up too badly today. Thank you for this. She gestured at the workshop framework, at the tools, at the entire Saturday spent teaching her things she'd never known she wanted to learn. Thank you for showing up. That's harder than it looks. Everything's harder than it looks. Yeah, but most people don't admit that. They just pretend and hope no one notices they're improvising. Her phone buzzed for the 14th time. Nathan, with weekend updates about Bloomberg running a series on leadership and crisis management that heavily featured Diane's collapse as a cautionary tale. She silenced it without reading. You're getting better at that. Marcus nodded toward the phone. The ignoring. I'm getting practice. Nathan's convinced I'm destroying my career by not responding immediately to every crisis. Are you? Probably. Diane watched Ethan climb the structure Lily had declared Dragon Headquarters, his movements more confident than they'd been a week ago. But I'm starting to think destroying the wrong career isn't the worst thing that could happen. Marcus's hand found hers, squeezed once. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the hard thing, which usually means it's the right thing. At 5 o'clock, they packed up tools with the ritual of people who'd built something together and knew the work wasn't finished, but had made progress that mattered.
Marcus offered to cook dinner, spaghetti again, because apparently that was his signature dish, and he saw no reason to diversify when excellence had already been achieved. Diane said yes before strategy could intervene with reasons why spending Saturday evening in a Bronx walk-up was different from spending Saturday afternoon in a Brooklyn park. The apartment felt familiar this time, less like foreign territory and more like a place she might learn to belong if she stopped cataloging differences and started noticing similarities. They cooked together, Diane's attempts at chopping garlic only slightly less disastrous than yesterday. Ethan set the table with Lily's supervision, the two of them negotiating placement of silverware with the seriousness of diplomats avoiding international incidents. The spaghetti was excellent because Marcus had apparently devoted years to perfecting red sauce that tasted like comfort transformed into cuisine. They ate at a table that seated 4 exactly, no extra chairs for guests who didn't exist, because this was a life built for 2 people who'd chosen small and deliberate over large and impressive. After dinner, the kids retreated to Lily's room to build the fort that had been promised since Wednesday, leaving Diane and Marcus alone with dishes and the particular intimacy of comfortable silence. I should probably tell you something. Marcus scrubbed a pot with focus that suggested he was avoiding eye contact deliberately. Before this gets more serious, Diane's stomach dropped. Here came the revelation, the complication, the reason this couldn't work despite wanting it to. Okay. Mass General called yesterday, offered me my job back. Part-time attending, 3 shifts a week, mentorship role. He set the pot down, finally looked at her. Salary's $180, benefits, structured schedule that's supposed to be sustainable. That's incredible. Congratulations. I haven't accepted yet. Why not? Marcus leaned against the counter, arms crossed in posture that suggested defense mechanisms activating. Because I walked away for a reason. Because I'm terrified of becoming that person again, the one who abandoned Lily for the OR. Because going back feels like admitting the last 3 years were a mistake. Diane moved closer, positioned herself in front of him where he couldn't avoid her. Were they a mistake? No. Best decision I ever made. His voice carried conviction that didn't waver. But I miss it. The surgery, the saves, the feeling of pulling someone back from dying. So take the job. And if I can't balance it, if I fall back into old patterns, then I'll tell you. She took his hands, found them warm and scarred and trembling slightly. That's what partners do. They tell each other when things are broken before the damage becomes permanent. Marcus's laugh was shaky around the edges. You're asking me to trust you with my biggest fear. And you're asking me to trust you with my son. Seems like we're even. He kissed her then, tasting like marinara and relief and all the futures they were building through choice instead of accident. From Lily's room came a crash, followed by immediate reassurance. It's okay. We meant to do that. Marcus broke away, grinning. That's never true. It's never meant to happen. Probably should check on structural integrity before the whole thing collapses. They found the kids buried under a fort that had indeed partially collapsed, both of them laughing with the abandon of children who understood that failure was just part of the process. Diane helped rebuild, Marcus directing reconstruction with patience that suggested this wasn't his first fort disaster. By 8 o'clock, Lily was fading, yawning between sentences about dragon defense strategies that clearly required more planning. Marcus carried her to bed over protests that she wasn't tired, she was just resting her eyes. There was a difference, and grown-ups never understood it. Ethan stood at the window, looking out at the Bronx spreading in layers of lights, lives stacked in vertical miles. Mama,
Can we move here? The question was so unexpected that Diane needed 3 seconds to process it. Move to the Bronx? Or Brooklyn, somewhere closer to Marcus and Lily? He turned to face her, hope and hesitation mixing into expression she was learning to decode.
The penthouse is too big and too quiet. Here feels like people actually live instead of just existing between scheduled activities. Marcus returned from putting Lily to bed, caught the tail end of Ethan's observation. The penthouse is pretty nice, though. I bet the view's incredible. The view's buildings. Ethan's dismissal was absolute. Here you can see people. That's better. Kid's got a point. Marcus ruffled Ethan's hair. Though the penthouse probably has better water pressure. Trade-offs everywhere. At 9, they called a car, still not ready to fully commit to subway life on weekends, but getting closer. Ethan fell asleep in the taxi again, exhausted by a day spent building things with his hands instead of his mind. Diane held him close, breathing in sawdust and childhood and the particular smell of sons who were learning that competence came through practice rather than innate talent. Her phone had 37 missed calls. Bloomberg had published a follow-up. The board wanted an emergency Monday meeting. Nathan had apparently decided her lack of response constituted crisis, requiring intervention. She dealt with none of it, choosing instead to watch Manhattan reassemble itself outside windows, to feel Ethan's weight against her shoulder, to catalog the ways her life was changing faster than strategy could manage. At home, she carried her son to bed, tucked him in under constellation sheets he'd chosen himself 3 years ago, during a brief period when she tried to be more involved before work had consumed her again. "Mama?" His voice was sleepy, barely conscious. "Yes, sweetheart. I like our Saturdays now. Better than the old ones where you worked and I had tutors." "Me too, baby. Me too." She stood in his doorway, watching him sleep, this small person she'd created and nearly lost, thinking about Marcus's question from the diner. "What are you fighting for?" Sunday she spent at the office because some habits died harder than others, and Monday's emergency board meeting required preparation even if she was no longer sure she cared about the outcome. Nathan met her there with coffee and judgment in equal measure. "You can't keep ignoring Bloomberg. Watch me. Diane, they're destroying your credibility. Questions about judgment, fitness, whether personal matters are compromising professional capacity." He spread printouts across her desk like evidence at a trial. "The board's spooked. Martinez wants reassurances. Even the members who voted with you are getting nervous." "Then they can be nervous." Diane scanned the articles without reading them, seeing headlines that said everything about how the world viewed women who chose anything besides total devotion to work. "I fired Gerald. The company's stable. Quarterly earnings are up." What exactly do they think I'm compromising? The appearance of total commitment. The appearance can go to hell. She looked up from papers that suddenly felt less important than they had a week ago. "I'm not performing commitment anymore. Either the results speak for themselves or they don't." Nathan was quiet, studying her with the focus of someone trying to solve equations that had stopped making sense. "Who are you right now? Because you're not the Diane I've worked with for 8 years. Maybe that Diane was the performance. Maybe this is what I look like when I stop pretending exhaustion equals excellence. And if the board doesn't accept that, then I'll know I'm leading the wrong thing." Monday's emergency meeting started at 9 sharp. Diane arrived at 8:55, prepared with facts, but no longer armored with the desperate need to win that had characterized every previous boardroom battle. The members filed in with expressions ranging from concerned to calculating. Men trying to determine whether they were witnessing evolution or collapse. Martinez spoke first. "Diane, we're grateful you could meet on short notice. Given recent media coverage, the board feels it's important to address concerns about leadership focus. Address away. Diane remained standing, but this time it felt like choice rather than strategy. Bloomberg's series raises questions about judgment during crisis. The photograph, the collapse, reports of missed calls and delayed responses. He spread his hands in gesture meant to convey regret while delivering ultimatum. We need reassurance that Harrington Global remains your priority. It doesn't. The silence that followed could have stopped hearts. Excuse me? Martinez's carefully neutral expression cracked into genuine shock. Harrington Global is important. It's not my priority. My priority is being Ethan's mother. The company is how I fund that life, not the thing I sacrifice that life for. Diane looked around the table, meeting eyes that had never seen her deviate from script. If that's unacceptable, I'll step down. Nathan's ready. He'll do fine. You can't be serious. Martinez found his voice first. You're willing to walk away from everything you've built because of some man you've known for a week? I'm willing to walk away because I collapsed from not eating, and my son didn't know I could cut his food. She heard the truth in her own words, felt it settling like foundation. Marcus is part of the equation, but the real question is whether I want to be my father, brilliant, successful, dead at 58 in a boardroom because the company consumed everything else. Your father built this company, and it killed him, just like it's been killing me. Diane pulled out her phone, showed them the photograph from Saturday, her and Ethan covered in sawdust, building a workshop neither of them knew how to build, but learning anyway. This is what I'm fighting for. A kid who knows his mother's name. A life that includes things besides quarterly earnings. A future where I'm still alive to see him graduate high school. She set the phone down with finality. So here's what's going to happen. I'm staying as CEO, but I'm implementing changes. Mandatory 50-hour work week caps for all executives. 6 weeks paid parental leave for everyone. On-site childcare. Mental health coverage. And I'm leaving at 5 every day unless there's actual emergency that requires intervention. That's insane! Thompson had found his voice. Shareholders will revolt. Shareholders can sell. I'll buy them out at premium if they're that desperate to flee companies that treat employees like humans. This is corporate suicide. This is corporate evolution. Diane gathered her materials, signaling that she was done regardless of whether they were. You want traditional leadership? Fire me. Promote Nathan. Find someone willing to die for quarterly returns. But I'm done pretending that's what strength looks like. Real strength is admitting when the cost is too high and choosing differently. She walked out before they could vote, before strategy could suggest staying was smarter, before fear could masquerade as responsibility and convince her to abandon truth for comfort. In her office, she found Marcus waiting, toolbox at his feet, looking completely out of place among the glass and steel and calculated wealth. Nathan called, said you might be making a scene. His smile was tentative, uncertain of his welcome. Thought you could use backup. You came to my office. First time for everything. Very fancy. I fixed your bathroom faucet while I was waiting. It was dripping. He gestured toward the executive washroom like invading CEO bathrooms was normal Tuesday behavior. Also, your desk chair was squeaking. Tightened the bolt. Should be good now. Diane crossed the space between them, kissed him hard enough that his toolbox tipped over with a crash that definitely carried through glass walls to where assistants were absolutely watching.
I think I just quit. Or got fired. Hard to tell. How do you feel? Terrified. Free. Like I just jumped off a building and I'm not sure if I'm flying or falling. Want to find out together? She thought about the workshop in Brooklyn, about Ethan learning to use tape measures, about Lily's wisdom and Saturdays spent building things that mattered more than market capitalization. Yeah, I really do. Nathan appeared in the doorway, face cycling through shock and resignation. Board voted. You're staying. They're accepting your terms with modifications to be negotiated. He looked at Marcus, at the overturned toolbox, at his boss kissing a handyman in her office while her career hung in balance. Also, I'm pretty sure HR is going to have questions. Let them question. Diane didn't step away from Marcus, didn't rush to restore professional distance, didn't apologize for being human in a building designed for machines. I'm done performing. This is what I look like when I'm actually living. It's terrifying, and I'm not sure I approve, but also kind of amazing. Nathan managed to smile. Your father would have hated this. I know. That's how I know it's right. They left Harrington Global together, Diane, Marcus, and a toolbox that had fixed more than just dripping faucets. Outside, Manhattan moved with its usual rhythm, millions of people conducting their own calculations about what mattered and what cost too much, and where the line between success and survival got drawn. Diane had spent 15 years on one side of that line. Now she was stepping across, hand in Marcus's scarred and steady grip, choosing presence over productivity and trusting that everything else would follow. Or it wouldn't. But either way, she'd still be able to look Ethan in the eye and say she'd tried. So what now? Marcus asked as they walked toward subway stairs she was finally ready to descend. Now we pick up our kids from school. We build that workshop. We teach them that broken things deserve patience. She squeezed his hand. And we see what happens when people choose life over empire. That's either very wise or completely insane. Probably both. Diane started down the stairs, pulling him with her into underground transit that smelled like humanity in all its messy glory. But I'm done being smart and safe. Smart and safe got me collapsing in boardrooms. This might kill me too, but at least I'll die doing something that matters. Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off tile walls. You know, for someone who just revolutionized corporate culture, you're remarkably dramatic about subway rides. I contain multitudes. Yeah, you do. They emerged at Brooklyn 40 minutes later, picked up Ethan and Lily from their respective schools, and returned to Riverside Park, where a workshop waited to be built, and children waited to learn that their hands could create instead of just consume. The sun was setting by the time they'd made real progress, 4 people working together to build something that would outlast their effort, that would teach kids they were capable of more than they'd been told. Standing in golden light with sawdust in her hair and her son's laughter carrying across grass, Diane felt something settle that she hadn't known was broken. This was what fighting for something looked like when you stopped fighting against everything else. This was what winning felt like when you measured victory in moments instead of market share. This was what happened when you chose to build instead of battle, to nurture instead of dominate, to live instead of just survive until dying seemed like the only way out. Marcus's hand found hers as they watched their children measure and mark and learned that precision mattered because approximate compounded into catastrophe. You okay? Better than okay. She leaned into him, let herself be held in ways she'd forgotten were possible. I'm terrified and broke and probably made every wrong decision according to everyone who matters. But Ethan knows my name, and I remember his, and that feels like winning. That is winning. He kissed the top of her head. Everything else is just math. And standing there in Brooklyn Park with empire crumbling behind her and future uncertain ahead, Diane Harrington finally understood what her father had never learned, that you couldn't take quarterly earnings to the grave, but you could leave behind people who knew how to build, fix, and care.
That was the only legacy worth having, the only victory worth claiming, the only success that actually survived the people who achieved it.